Right, we're going to make this into an experience. So, good. So we have Arthur here giving some immediate feedback. Apparently his right hand is when it's funny. The left hand is when it's not funny. Okay, good. That's immediate feedback for you. Right, so we want to start, because there's going to be a lot of hidden things in our talk. So I need you to be awake and really into the flow of this whole presentation. So we're going to start with an exercise. So let's see if we get everyone to participate. So I would like you, all of you, to stand up. That is brilliant. Okay, we almost have a full house. Awesome. See, there's not a lot of resistance to change here. That's brilliant. That will come back in our talk. And now I'm just going to do a breathing exercise with you. It's really just to keep me calm. All right, good one. All right, so let's close our eyes. Brilliant. And now you breathe in. And then you breathe out. Brilliant. Okay, and now you can sit down. And notice how relaxed you now feel. So your brain should be ready to absorb all of the things that we're going to talk about. Now, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. It's more about what I'm passionate about. So I am passionate about creating highly performant and self-organizing teams. I see that as a very big part of scaling Agile. And that passion came about from when I was very little. So when I was little, I remember I probably was around 4 or 5, sneaking into my parents' bedroom, and I dismantled their alarm clock because I wanted to see how it worked. And it's always been a passion of mine to know how things work, but in particular, people, because there's nothing more complex than people. And when we can really harness the strength of individuals, and even more as teams, we can achieve anything. Because think about it, people, they change the world. And that is why I am passionate about that aspect of scaling Agile in particular, but there's other reasons. We'll get back to our talk. And then I've got my fantastic co-host, Alex.
Hiya. So I'm Alex. I've been in the IT industry for around 10 years now. I started off as a software tester. But actually I started off, well, as a software tester, but then I developed into an exploratory software tester. And why is this important? Well, for me, my passion is around critical thinking. Looking at the bigger picture, really asking those hard questions, I love that. So when I found Agile, it gave me the opportunity to drive and go into something so complex. So I became a Scrum Master. I've been a Scrum Master now for around 3 years, and it's given me the opportunity to work with teams, help them experiment, help them find the waste in the system. I'm all about effective collaboration. I gave a talk a few years ago here about effective collaboration, and that really is my passion.
Oh.
So, why this talk? Does anyone recognize this ship? Yeah? Few. Okay, so this is obviously the Titanic. So why am I showing you a picture of the Titanic? Well, actually, this is a really good symbol of business. Businesses can go along in a straight line and not realize there are icebergs. And what businesses need to do to be successful is they need to be able to pivot. So how do you pivot? Well, what you need to do, and I believe this, is we need to be agile. We need to be able to react to the market. So we need to be able to spot the icebergs in this analogy, and we need to be able to find new harbours. We need to be able to find the opportunities to give the value to the customer. So we're going to be talking about scaling.
Yes, and the Titanic was a massive ship, right? And it's the same thing, the bigger your business is, the harder it is to pivot. Now, you have to think, when you have a really big company, you have so many individuals, but you've got that creative brain power, you've got the different roles, you've got such an immense resource at your hands. But you have to be able to really, all of those elements have to be able to turn. And that's where Agile comes in. So with our talk, we're going to focus on the elements needed for effectively scaling Agile. And for scaling Agile effectively, you need to think about what's at the foundation of Agile. So there's the transparency, right? There's a level of predictability still needed. There's collaboration. So when you want to scale effectively, you need to scale transparency, scale predictability, and scale collaboration. So I wanted to ask you, but actually I gave away the answer now, but I actually wanted to ask you, what do you think is the biggest impediment to scaling Agile? Well, you kind of could, I shouldn't have done that. I should have thrown it away. You should raise your funny hand now. But anyway, so the biggest impediment is organizational versus Agile culture conflicts. So instead of asking you what you thought it was, I still want to ask the room, what's your experiences with this? Like how many of you agree with these 52% of business professionals that list organizational culture versus Agile culture as the biggest impediment to Agile adoption and Agile scaling? So can I see a show of hands who agrees with that? I can see some hands going, yes. Okay, perfect. Ooh, kind of, a little bit, hesitating. All right, hopefully we'll be able to convince you by the end. So when I talk about organizational culture versus Agile culture, so I can give a few examples. A lot of companies, they work with rewards, and you can reward individual stars. There's a lot of benefits doing that, but when Agile focuses so much on collaboration, you have to make sure that you get that reward system correct, and that you make sure that those individual stars don't start focusing too much on themselves, but still focus on that collaboration, that bigger picture. That's how you get that big ship to turn when you need it to turn. Another thing that can seep in is if there's distance, there could be blame. So they're all elements that could play a part in this organizational versus Agile culture conflict. And we'll see more examples as we go through this. Another one I wanted to point out, because it's still related to culture. It's all about behavior, because we're people, right? People make something a success, or the opposite. We have to remember that. Resistance to change. We've got a good example, actually. Something that we've encountered ourselves. And what happens is, a lot of the time, people will point to management as a failure to adopting Agile. However, one of the examples that I wanted to share is the teams. So you have to put yourself kind of in the shoes of the teams. So they've been working potentially in a startup, a very agile way of working, very quick, autonomous. They don't have to justify themselves outside. They have their own little unit that they're working with. They're able to work fast, and they have a lot of pride in doing that. So when you start scaling, there can be resistance. And because when you're bigger, you do have to plan more. You have to communicate more. You need more processes. You need more tools. You need more documentation, because it's a different form of communication across a bigger organization. So what you sometimes see happening is that people start saying, well, why all of a sudden have we moved from Agile to Waterfall? You know, they go from one extreme to the other, because they start seeing a little bit of extra planning, a little bit of extra documentation, and the fear creeps in. Creeps in? Yeah? It works. So when you start seeing that, put the emphasis on that bigger ship. You're part of something bigger, and that's what you need to focus on. Go. How's this for a number? I'm just going to let it sink in. 85% of employees worldwide are not engaged or are actively disengaged in their jobs. I mean, that's incredible, right? And here in Western Europe, it's even worse. 10% of employees are actively engaged in their job. Now, what do you think that does to delivery? I can tell you, it's not good. Exactly.
So let's go back to 2001, when Agile was created. So it was a bunch of individuals in the Utah mountains. They went skiing. And what were they doing? They were chatting, they were collaborating, they were having fun. But what they were really doing is they were able to get together and think of something to be able to absolutely disrupt the system. We're here now, 18 years later, talking about Agile from a bunch of 17 people. Why were they able to do this? They were able to do it because they were engaged, they were passionate about what they were doing, and they were completely driven.
Exactly. And it's that engagement, right, that makes everything happen. So, and I see it over and over. When I'm coaching teams and I see the teams that tap into that engagement, it has a real effect on what they deliver, on the quality, on how they are invested, how they brainstorm together. It's so much better. So you have to focus on getting that engagement back into the workplace. And as you can see, collectively, we've got some work to do. So I wanted to, I hope it's clear by now that culture is actually the biggest impediment to adopting Agile or scaling Agile. And that's why we're focusing on it so much in this talk. So we're going to share a little bit of examples of some toxic cultures that we have both experienced. And we will point out some of the tips on how to avoid or better them. And let's start with Alex's fascinating story.
So, I'm going to tell you a story now from back when I was a tester. So, I was working at a company that was actually doing something similar to what Alan was talking about earlier when he mentioned using video to do estimatics. So, what I was doing is I was testing the software, going through the report, checking that the numbers were added up and that kind of thing. So, I was testing away and I found a defect. I thought, okay, well, I'll just double check. So, yeah, there's definitely a defect. So I stood up, walked out of the silo, which was the test area, walked into the dev area, and walked up to the developer, and he was there with his headphones in, not giving me any contact at all. And I walked up to his desk, and I said, sorry, can I get your attention? No, nothing. Give him a little wave. He knew I was there. Anyway, he finally stopped what he was doing, and he did this. Took his headphone out and just looked at me. He gave me this stare, like, who are you? You tester. So I was there, and then he said, what? I said, I'm sorry, like I've been adding up these values, and they just don't work. I think there's a bug in the system. I can come and show you if you like. And he said, that's a funny one, because I've got a degree in maths from Oxford University, and I don't think you have. So naturally I was like, whoa, that's not very nice. And I said, well, I don't need a maths degree, I used a calculator. So, but in that example, what I did is I basically became an arsehole back, because he really offended me and made me feel so small that naturally, I'm not that way inclined, but in that moment, I was just trying as hard as I could just to be nasty back. But what does that really mean? When we talk about it at an individual level, then it affects the people around us, but not necessarily at wider business. We'll talk about the scaling of position to toxic culture in a moment. But I'd just like to ask a question. Has anyone experienced that? Yeah? Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, did it make you feel disengaged? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, brilliant.
Cool. I'm going to continue with a story. So Alex talked about peer toxic culture. I'm going to talk about senior toxic culture. And what I did is I actually measured it. Now, I've gotten really fond of measurements for some reason. But it paints a picture, doesn't it? So I was working at a company where the culture was actually pretty good. So on average, we had a lot of collaboration, and we worked with an external company, but they felt like they were part of us. So it was really good. But something happened. The external company, they worked together with our internal team, and they met a milestone that we needed to meet from a marketing point of view. And one of the senior stakeholders was looking at it, and he said, well, what's this? Because this is not at all what I need. Why did you guys basically mess it up? So the blame crept in. And what happened is, after that, the number of individuals that came up to me and said, look, I feel really bad about this. Like, our team worked their butt off. Can I say that? I just did. So,
I think I said arsehole, so.
Yeah, there you go. We were starting a theme, right? So they worked really hard. They felt insulted. They felt like all of their hard work wasn't being recognized, because at the end of the day, they did what they thought was right with the knowledge that they had at the time. It came down to a pure misunderstanding that we could learn from. But not only that, the teams that worked with the external team that got the blame, like a few days after, they started surfacing things like, yeah, you know that other thing that they did like a few weeks ago? That wasn't actually that good either. Because everyone, because the blame surfaced, started going into protective mode. And like that, it just expands. And like that, you get that toxic culture just rippling through.
So, does everyone recognize this little guy? Yeah? So it's a meerkat. So what do we know about meerkats? Well, they're social creatures. But what do? When they see fear or feel fear, like we explained, then they do one of two things. They either freeze or they run back and then have the effect on the rest of the group.
And people aren't that much different. I mean, we're not maybe that cute and fluffy. Although that microphone, yes. But in the way that we... What did Arthur just say, that you're cute and fluffy? All right. All right. So, but our behaviors, they aren't very different. We'll get to why that is in a bit. But when we think about it, when we experience fear from blame or anything else, we start acting differently. We start protecting ourselves. And when you then need to scale transparency, let me tell you something, that's not going to work. So you have to, again, focus on scaling that transparency, scaling that predictability. You need that openness for that. You need that collaboration and scaling that collaboration. So as a tip, wanted to say, instead of avoiding emotion, because it does make me laugh or actually cry sometimes. I've been in cultures in the past where companies were trying to almost force people to, like, be professional, right? And they usually mean don't show any emotion. And it's a thing like we're human beings. It's in our nature to feel emotion. And actually emotion is incredibly strong. Because all of the stuff that we do, like why do we get married? Well, emotion, right? Why would we do it otherwise? When we achieve stuff, it's emotion that drives us. So instead of trying to say, avoid the emotion, I would say, lean into it, understand it, and harness it. Because there's incredible power in harnessing emotion. So with this one, there's one last one left. So we went from peer to senior to management, and you can see the spread on there. And I've got a story to share, again from the same company actually. So we had a junior product owner. Are there any product owners in the room, by the way? Yeah, okay, yeah, oh, cool, awesome. And this junior product owner, she was really talented, but she was still learning, so she was bound to make mistakes, right? And what happened is, again, she met this fantastic milestone with her team, and she thought she did everything right. But then in front of the company, when she announced it, one of the managers stood up. And this manager, she, of course, had her own emotional baggage and her own view of the world. And she stood up and she said, well, why wasn't I aware of this? Why wasn't my team briefed? This is absolutely unacceptable. So you can already see what damage that will have done to the product owner in question. But not just that. After that, a shift happened in the company. And we saw people just having that apathy, like they didn't want to work anymore. That engagement was gone. Others, they just left. Then others, they were starting to, again, overprotect themselves. So they were scaling documentation, but not for the reason to share it, but for the reason to protect themselves. And that's very different. So be aware of those things. I think Alex also has a short story.
Yeah. So I knew this developer who was a very, very clever guy, or is a very clever guy, I should say. And he thought his code was perfect, bug-free, and no, it's not the same guy I spoke about earlier. But he was very good at playing the game. He ended up going from a developer to the CTO. But what happened? Well, we were doing big bang releases. We were doing 6-month releases. And the reality with that is, as most people probably know, is that they usually go wrong because you're trying to put so much code into the system all at once, and it generally doesn't work. So as testers, we were there all night trying to get this thing into live, obviously trying to deliver the value to our customers, and it didn't work. So next morning, we get in, we're really tired, done an all-nighter, and unfortunately, it was rolled back. The CTO walks in. He walks through the office and comes over to the testers, and he says, "Good morning, bottleneck." Yeah. Great start of the day. So, not only that, he then said, "Why did you guys cause the rollback?" As if it was the tester's fault for the whole kit. But what does that mean? So in that environment, having a CTO come over to mere test, I mean, I'm talking serious hierarchy, I know I'm playing it up, but it was like that. That when you had the CTO come over to test, it was a big deal. And for him to address you as one, the bottleneck, and then blame you for basically destroying the release, it was horrible, but it was visual. It was visual, and the whole department saw this behavior. And this is someone who we should be, the leadership, we should be inspired by these people, we should be learning from these people, but we're learning completely the wrong behaviors. So, as Brigitte said, when you have that kind of fear, because ultimately, we're in a blame culture. So he's the CTO, but he's having to report into the CEO, and he has to blame someone, because that's how it worked. So what we have, if we look at the Agile Manifesto here, is that we all know that we should really be focusing on the left-hand side, not to say that we don't have any of the right, but in that culture, we put way more effort on the right-hand side. I love this statement. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, what does that mean? Well, I interpret Peter Drucker as saying, businesses, we need to take this seriously. Because when you have culture, and a healthy culture, then basically success comes naturally. We have to remember that we are humans, and we're not just donkeys where you can put a carrot on a stick, or robots you can just tell what to do. And for that, we need to really look at ourselves, and this is where we can look at
neuroscience. There you go. That was a smooth transition. Right. So this is a picture of our beautiful brain. And I wanted to explain why we are human, basically. So look at how beautiful this looks. And it really kind of is like that, because when you look at the top side of our brain, you've got that whole creative element. We've got the ability to solve complex problems. And there's so much more that we can do. However, inside of that beautiful top brain, there's a survival brain. Some people call it a monkey brain. And that brain was there from the early days when we lived in caves and stuff like that. And we all of a sudden saw a saber-toothed tiger, and then we had to probably run away very quickly, or freeze behind a tree and hope that they don't see us, or fight. But yeah, I wouldn't really recommend that against a saber-toothed tiger. But that's our primal brain. That's how that brain works. And when that brain gets activated, and it gets activated when we feel stressed, when we feel under threat. So when that brain gets activated, you can forget about all the rest around it. You know, you can forget about the creativity, about the logical thinking. So you actually reduce your capacity to think clearly when you're in this state of stress. What's even worse than that, I love neuroscience, by the way, so I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to that. So a few years ago, they thought that our brains, they didn't evolve. So at a certain age, that was it, that was our brain. Now luckily, science has shown us that that's not the case. Our brain continuously evolves, which is a good thing, because it means that we can always pivot ourselves, but it's also a dangerous thing. So if you live in a constant state of fear, so your brain kind of sees it as I'm in survival mode, those neural pathways will be created to actually keep reinforcing that state of stress. So once that you have a toxic culture, it can actually physically alter your brain. So that's quite an interesting thing to think about. So I hope it's clear by now that culture is more than just getting like a beer fridge or a few cinema tickets. It's a complex thing that you need to take into account. And all of the other things are very nice and they're a big part of it. But there's a whole level of complexity that we need to be aware of.
So now we've heard some anecdotes, we've heard our stories. But to quote Jim Barksdale, if we have data, let's look at the data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. So, we've heard our opinions, let's see the data. Who loves a graph? Come on. No? I love a graph. Especially one that looks like that. So, what are we looking at here? We're looking at engagement versus success. So what does success mean? Well, we've got financial customer retention, safety, quality, and absenteeism. But what does that mean? So if we focus on the top percentile, the 75 to 100%, you can see that you have, well, we've got the stats here, 17% higher productivity and 21% more profitable. That engagement is huge to actual numbers, businesses' physical numbers. But what you can really see is when you get that top 1%, they are 4 times more successful.
And the numbers don't stop there. So when you look at disengagement, it can lead to brain drain. And actually with the millennials, which I see a lot of young, fresh faces in the audience, so a lot of you are part of that group, they don't take it. Like if a culture is bad, they will leave, even if there's nothing else for security in place. So that becomes, from a business point of view, even worth more consideration when you think about losing all that talent. So if you look at, again, so this is the bottom quartile, that's the top quartile in engagement. So the top quartile in engagement, they have 41% lower absenteeism. They have 40% lower quality incidents. Again, it makes sense, right? Because our brain needs to think as much as it can about that quality. If we're in survival mode, we won't do that. And then when it comes to turnover or churn, so basically people leaving, when you have a company that usually is for example, in a sector where you already have high turnover or high churn, then when you look at engaged business units versus low engaged business units, 24% lower turnover. When you look at a company that normally has low turnover anyway, the highly engaged ones, almost 60% lower turnover versus the bottom ones. So a tip, invest in culture. It really is worth the return on investment.
So we know Agile is currently at its peak. I mentioned earlier it was created in 2001. So we're well on the journey. So let's have a look. We talk about Agile frameworks, not at scale. So on the left-hand side there, we can see Scrum as the front runner. We can also see Scrum Band and Scrum XP Hybrid. So it's around 70-ish% of the Scrum-based framework. So it's really leading the way. But when we talk about scaling Agile, it's still a fairly new concept, and there isn't really a massive front runner. So we have SAFe here that's 30%, but there isn't really anything that's leading the way.
Yeah, so when you're looking at those scaling frameworks, another thing to really consider is what you're going to choose. So imagine that you are a startup and you have a very agile mindset already built in, and you're naturally scaling, right? What framework would you choose? Well, you have to think about culture, again, in the elements. Some of these frameworks, for example, the Spotify model, they focus more on the cultural aspect built in. So that might be a good choice in that situation. But if you're scaling, so again, you might be small, medium-sized, and if you already have an agile foundation, a strong agile foundation. But let's say that you're bringing on board a bigger partner who's maybe not that used to agile ways of working. You need to make sure that that communication flows as natural as possible. So one of the advantages of using a framework like, for example, SAFe, is that the terminology and the processes are probably more familiar than people coming from a non-agile background. So if you want to be inclusive and harness that strength of that big ship, then think about that in your choice when you're choosing a framework.
So we've talked about culture being incredibly important, but we also need to understand a couple of other things. So the 13th State of Agile survey told us that 42% consider DevOps transformation as very important. Well, why is this? Well, when we're scaling, we need DevOps transformation because we need to reduce the dependencies. At the moment, when we have smaller teams and less teams, we're able to communicate with each other. But when we scale, we need to be able to visualize and see the dependencies and hopefully reduce them. So having integrated people in the teams to be able to release the software is, well, it's very important. So, implementing continuous delivery. Why is this important? Well, again, like I said earlier, 6 monthly releases, it's just not going to work. You're not going to be able to pivot. We need to be able to scale that. So, having continuous delivery allows us to ship products on a regular basis and reduce the risk. So the final one was using tools. So, we need tools, as Brigitte was talking about earlier about the transparency. We need to be able to have the tools so we can communicate to the other business units and the other departments. So when we're scaling, we need to have that plan. We need to have that idea and project that to the rest of the people in the business.
Exactly. And the next slide. So remember that we have Agile at its peak. So we had that pretty picture of a mountain and people on top and yay! Okay, what's next, you think? Yes. So in every product journey, there's always a time where the product goes downhill. And of course, when something's at its peak, there's the danger that it's going to go downhill. Now, when it comes to Agile, I'm pretty passionate about it, as I hope you can see. And I don't really want to let that happen. And what happens often is people see that it's not working, and the numbers are also showing that. You know, there are some projects failing, so people start thinking, it's the framework, yeah? Probably not. That's probably not the root cause. The root cause is probably in something that was actually identified as the root cause. But sometimes people just move on to the next thing. But I hope that all of you in this room are passionate enough about Agile to actually not make this happen, because it is an incredible framework, an incredible methodology that combines those cultural benefits with delivery of value.
Okay, so we have power. The manifesto, probably this doesn't come as news to anyone, everyone's probably seen this before, at least I hope you guys have seen this before. So, when we have Agile, we have a manifesto, but now we have this new concept, we have this concept of scaling. So we need to scale the manifesto. We obviously want to put our efforts into the left-hand side, the individuals, interactions, working software, and so on. We know that. But as we mentioned, when you scale, you really need to scale everything else. So having those processes and tools, having that documentation, we need to be able to communicate and be transparent to other areas of the business. And we need to have a plan. So, what can we do? People like Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, whatever it may be, we need to help teams. We need to help teams understand the value of this. We need to understand teams the value of scaling. Take it back to that boat. Realize that the company is going to get bigger, and we need to be able to be agile and pivot. So we need to scale the manifesto. So, we need to be part of something bigger, and it's about getting the teams to feel like a part of something bigger. The Agile release cycle is usually a 2-week sprint, 1 to 3 weeks, usually 2-week sprint, where a team's able to take a bit of work, deliver it, get some feedback, move on. But that's very much focused on the team level. That's the Agile. We're talking about scaling. So how do we do that? So in a process like LESS, you have a sprint on a product level, or SAFe would call it a product increment. The terminology, it doesn't matter. What's important is actually that we understand we're part of a bigger team now. We're part of a bigger process.
And you start that process. We just switched places. So you start that process with, start with the why. So who has heard of Simon Sinek? Yay, awesome, okay, good. So we're looking at purpose. When you do, so we do PI planning, so we follow the SAFe framework. When you start off PI planning, you try and focus on creating that why, because that why is incredibly important to drive engagement, because a lot of people are driven by purpose. So when you can explain the why and you set that North Star that we are all as a big ship heading towards, then it has incredible value for all the teams delivering. So again, alignment, engagement, success.
So some of you may have read Dan Pink's book, Drive. Anyone read that? Jeez. Oh, nice. Okay, brilliant. So in that book, Drive, he talks about 3 things that knowledge workers need to be engaged, and that's purpose, mastery, and autonomy. So we've already talked about purpose. So let's talk about autonomy, and how does that look in SAFe? Well, what we have is these PI events, where we get 100 people together, probably around that, all together in one location, and helping the teams build a plan themselves that they can be proud of. And if you have that engagement in building the plan, as we saw with the results, you're more likely to succeed.
And the last piece of the puzzle, mastery. It's basically learning, continuous learning, right? Continuously improving. And within the teams, you've got your retros, you've got other ways of learning quickly. When you're, again, scaling, you need to find other ways of inspecting and adapting fairly quickly. Now, one of the things that we've seen to basically use that inspect and adapt and lead to mastery is try and identify win-wins. Because when people sit down for a long time, like that breathing exercise I let you do in the beginning, it's with reasons. You know, it's to create that flow, it's to get your brain engaged. So when we have a few presentations, after that, try and put a natural break, but don't just make it a break, make it a win-win situation. So what we do is to inspect and adapt some of the lessons from the increment so that we can take them to the next one, is we turn it into a game. We gamify the data that otherwise can sometimes be a bit boring, you know. And that leads to this. So this is a quote from Robert, and he said, "I loved the quiz. I think it was the first time I really started to search for information that's important from the department's perspective." So you can see you're creating that unit just by not just by playing a game. And we also have themes. So this one was for a winter release. So of course we had Game of Thrones, winter's coming. And you can see on the picture, so this is an actual picture from the event, you can see people are engaged. You know, it's amazing to have that collaboration as part of it. Then we're running out of time. But I quickly wanted to say, okay. Improvising again. So you have multiple teams. When you look at how big businesses sometimes experiment in the marketplace, you can use that in the same way with your Agile culture. So you can focus on taking some of those teams and trying to use a strategy. Yes, brilliant, thank you. Use a strategy that you believe in, and then measure the impact. So this is an example of a feedback workshop that I created for one of the teams. So I set them a North Star to become highly performant and self-organizing, because I wanted them to know what we wanted the outcome to be. And the first step towards that is you have to be able to be radically honest with each other. So as part of that, we did a feedback exercise where we basically used a SWOT analysis. Who's familiar with a SWOT analysis? Yes, awesome. So strengths and weaknesses we focused on, but the opportunities lay in where we saw that there was compatibility or maybe someone who had one strength and the other person had this other weakness. So they would then get together and help each other overcome that. It proved to be incredibly valuable because this team in particular, their numbers, their cycle time actually got divided by half. So it was quite impressive, the impact. But it does become stale. You have to continuously do this. So use your coaches, managers, Scrum Masters, whoever you have in your company that focuses on the element of culture within the teams, use them to create this ongoing focus on delivery. I'm out of breath because I'm trying to finish in time. I know.
So I absolutely love this slide because I think it tells a great picture. And the reality is, culture does eat strategy for breakfast, and we hope you all agree.
Cool. And then we have one last slide, but we wanted to put this in the background. Just to kind of show you all the tips, and you can, yeah, perfect. You can take a picture if you want to, and which some people are doing. Thank you, I appreciate that. And if you have any questions, by all means, come and see us. I don't think we have time for them now. Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.